Jean-Luc Godard is a very interesting filmmaker who also connects in with the idea of the sublime. In this film, a short film, Germany 9/0, he is essentially talking about the end of East Germany, the coming down of the wall, which he associates both with the end of Europe and with the end of cinema. And so the whole film is suffused with a sort of melancholia, a kind of loss of an originary past, a sort of glory days of cinema, a sort of glory days of nature. And the natural environment that he depicts in the film is really worth examining. He depicts a nature that is waning, that is on the way out. As for any of you who have experienced the sort of slow death of somebody, it's almost as if what you're watching is nature slowly dying and disappearing. And in that disappearance there's a great beauty. As you can see here, this is a poisoned landscape in a mining environment in East Germany. He depicts it at sunset, which is the waning of the day, and he has this very warm light which deflects up off the landscape. The mist is coming up off the ground and off the waterways, and the whole thing is a kind of nocturnal sonata to the end of nature. There is also this deep and pessimistic sense that human beings are not capable of dealing with the responsibilities assigned to them as caretakers of each other and of the world. And the pessimism is not just visual, it's also intellectual. There's a call to a sort of end point, a sort of Armageddon or end of the world, which he likens at the end of Germany. And then he depicts these scenes in the Ruhr Valley of massive mining, taking things out of the earth, and the lost kind of, this is a detective that he uses in a lot of his other films, just wandering through that landscape, wondering what it's all about. And then you have the sort of bourgeois side of life which breaks in now and then, which Godard trivializes. Here, the jogger. What effect is the jogger, who's happy and healthy, going to have on the fact that the planet is disappearing? How relevant is jogging? Do you know what I mean? So he makes this point by constant contrasts. In this case, contrasting a sort of visual condition with a textual condition that recalls a religious experience, a political condition, a technological human history condition, and a kind of modern critique. All of these things happen in flash movements from one shot to the next. And so the way Godard constructs his films is through this kind of collage or montage that is disjointed, that is disjunct. Now some architectural examples. If you've been to India, you realize that there is no such thing as wilderness, as untouched nature, because in the Hindu world, nature is sanctified by the acts of human beings. And so here you have the example of a fascinating, a fantastical natural phenomenon. I think it's called Camel Rock, which has been appropriated by people and turned into a temple. And by turning a natural world, a natural event, a natural phenomenon into a human place, you bring that natural phenomenon to another level. You sanctify it, you appropriate it, you domesticate it, you acculturate it, but essentially you bring it out of itself into itself. You make it more what it is by what you do to it, by meddling with it. Who in Australia would think of painting in whitewash parts of national parks? Well, I shouldn't say that because Aboriginal culture does the same. Important sites are marked and by doing so assigned a role that is higher or different or more powerful than the role it has in its natural state. What art does here, by which I mean the art of sacred works on nature or the art of architecture, is in a way modify the natural in order to heighten and amplify its power. So the top of a very distinctive hill here at Vijayanagar is turned into a shrine. The tree has a shrine built right up against it. because the God lives in the tree, and by sanctifying the tree you increase its power, and by increasing its power you increase its benefit back to human beings. That's a very particular attitude to nature, okay? It's not about leaving nature alone, you know, we are too weak to touch it, or we're just going to wreck it, or anything like that, which is kind of our attitude. Or you have this attitude, which is, oh, here's a beautiful tree, we'll turn it into a shrine. Another attitude to nature now. The mosque at Cordova, which is this internal space, is made up of two areas. On the left, you have a grove of orange trees open to the sky. On the right, you have the larger rectangle, which is the internal space of the mosque. The whole is surrounded by a double wall, which is cellular. And there's one entrance you can see on the left-hand side towards the bottom. You enter the garden, and then from the garden you move into the mosque itself. In the middle of the mosque, I wish we could forget it, but we can't, is a Catholic, well, let's say a Christian church that was built by the conquerors, by the people who came to throw Islam out the window, and they basically destroyed an entire section of the mosque to build their cathedral. So you have a kind of modified sense of what the space would have been like originally. But what do we see here? First of all, we see the creation of a boundary that separates the world outside from the world inside. So it is the creation of a templum. A templum, which means a place set aside, a place set apart from the world. And that sanctifies that place, it makes it special. Then that big rectangle is further subdivided into two. One, a natural grid of orange trees, fruit-producing trees, and on the other side, a crystalline or artificial version of the garden that's made of columns, which you see here. One can analyze a space like this indefinitely. It just keeps opening up all kinds of implications. But just think for a moment of what you're looking at. You are looking at an artificial forest. You are looking at clearings within the forest, that is, places of gathering within a forest. You're looking at the notion of orienting yourself to those places within the disorienting quality of the forest. Very easy to get lost in a forest. You can't see the boundaries of the space. The columns have been made dark by people touching them, but they are also of dark granite and quite different from any other part of the structure. Granite is an important material because of its origin and the belief that it has a certain power, a certain energy. Because you can't see the edges of the space, the edges seem indefinite. In other words, this forest could go on and on and on. Remember that you're entering from Cordova, a very tightly knit, small street, medieval patterned urban texture, into first a garden, the first clearing, and then secondly into a space which is itself a garden but reversed. The space has no direction, no particular direction. If you know that in Islam the mosque has no particular direction apart from the mihrab, which you see there on the right hand side in that darker assemblage of rooms, that is the direction of Mecca. So when you're praying, you are in that space and everyone has to face that direction. In other words, all the people praying are in a radial formation facing Mecca. Quite different from the Christian church, where everyone sits in neat rows facing parallel. All over the world, all the churches, ideally anyway, are sitting in parallel rows facing east. You see, very, very different condition in our relationship to the planet. Now that must have an effect on how we relate to the world and relate to each other. If we are all radial, if we consider ourselves radial, then that is very different to if we consider ourselves parallel, you see? And so you've got a distinctive difference between the Islamic concept of the world and of human beings' place in it and the Christian. If we move now to the tectonics of the place made within the mosque, you can see a series of banded spaces. These are the columns, clearly enough. These are the arches above the columns, and there are arches going in the other direction, higher up. So you've got these linear spaces that band in a sort of layer across the space, and that layer goes against your axis of entry. But you don't notice that on ground level, right? There is a kind of homogeneity about the ground level, as there is in a forest. You can go anywhere. But as you rise up, you notice that the place is layered. It's laid in several ways. The capital of the columns establishes the first layer. The first layer of arches establishes the second layer. Then there's a second layer of arches above that, which is a third layer. Then above that there is a sort of springing point of the arches, a fourth layer. Above that there are the other arches going in the other direction, sixth layer. And then there are the lanterns which are punched up through the roof. You can see how the light is coming in at spots. These are the lanterns disposed evenly in the space, which represents a seventh layer. So what you've got then is a sort of overlaid canopy of arches going in different directions and of light coming down and being fractured and broken up and creating these patterns of light on the ground, very much as you would find in a rainforest. So it wouldn't surprise us to know that the mosque in Islam is considered to be a symbol of paradise. And doubly unsurprising that the vegetal and rainforest metaphor of the building also has a climatic function in reducing glare, cooling the space, and therefore being much more comfortable to be in than outside where it's hot and dry. So there's a lot going on, right, in the building in terms of how we relate to the world. How do we relate to the world when we're in this building? We don't relate to it through a picture window. We relate to it by being actually separated from it, radically separated from it. And in our radical separation, we're also encouraged to reconnect to it at a higher level, at a symbolic level. So this is not a forest, it is not a rainforest, it is not a clearing in a forest, but in a way it is the epitome of what it would be like to experience that. So you see that the role of architecture here is to bring nature out of itself into a higher level of experience, and then bringing people into that experience by the way that it controls space, materials, technology, and so on. Another example for nature and the relationship of human beings to place is in Leonardo's Annunciation. If you know the story, the angel comes to tell Mary that she will bear the child who is the Son of God and the Saviour of mankind. For a woman, what a charge. She's not sure how to take it, and there's a whole history, pictorial history of analysis that's open to interpretation about this motif. All the great painters have painted it, all have done it in a slightly different way, each of them representing a different kind of value system. In Leonardo's painting, just have a look at the way in which place is organized. I keep now moving between place and space. I'll talk about space in a moment. But just in terms of place, what do you have? You have a garden with a low wall which separates it from so-called nature outside. The next layer beyond the garden is this series of trees, pine trees, which you see stylized, very stylized, and representing a sort of grove, but a kind of domesticated grove. So it's a kind of garden or park. Beyond that, you just see over here a kind of rude hill or mountain with a kind of wilderness around the base of it. So you have at least 4 degrees of existence. You have architecture, you have the garden, the enclosed garden, you have the park, and you have the wilderness. And these are set up by Leonardo in very interesting ways. If you look now, you will now need to move to the spatial analysis. The angel and Mary face each other across the canvas, and so there's an axial relationship to them. And the garden also extends that axial relationship. It belongs to that relationship of socialized existence. Then Leonardo, between the two figures, Leonardo sets up this axis roughly through the middle of the painting that then moves from that garden through 2 other kinds of natural environments, the park and the wilderness, and then the sky and, if you like, the infinity beyond. So you have a crossing, okay, of 2 axes. And that crossing is poised on the wall, the boundary or the limit between the domesticated world and the world of nature, which at its epitome is wilderness. So you can see this is a very Renaissance attitude to the world. It's about constructing a known, controllable, organized, rational universe over and against the wilderness that is chaotic. It's not only a Renaissance idea, but it originates in ancient Greece with a sort of horror of chaos, of uncontrolled growth. We now have that returning to us with a vengeance as the city grows so uncontrollably that it horrifies us in the same way as originally wilderness would have horrified our ancestors.